Okay. Hey,
Hey.
hey, Blogging Heads Nation. This is Razib Khan of Gene Expression on the Science Blogs Network, and I am here with.
I'm Jake Young, pure Pedantry, also of the Science Blogs Network.
It was nice talking to you today, Jake. Let us just begin. We want to start talking about heritability first, and why don't we go back to a couple of years ago when we first started talking about this topic and in the specific context of an article in the New York Times?
Absolutely. Well, so we first started talking about this in reference to the idea of heritability of obesity. And the problem that I think both you and I had about it was that people tend to represent heritability estimates as percentages of how much of a trait is genetic, which is a misuse of the term heritability. That's not what it means at all. And I think that people tend to kind of stumble over it. So I think that we should talk about like what that actually means.
Okay, so in specific concrete terms, let's say, I'm just throwing a number out there. Let's say that the heritability of obesity is 70%.
Sure.
Okay, so when someone hears that, I think the first thing that they think is obesity is mostly due to genes. Then they observe some other real facts in the world, such as most Americans are obese, or they're much more obese than say people in parts of Europe, other parts of the world, in Japan. If you say that obesity is mostly heritable and you see differences across nations, you can adduce from that the differences are due to genes and you can't do anything about that. But that's really not what heritability of 70% is saying.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, you could. The counter argument that I always make to people who make that argument is that the prevalence of obesity, which is right now in the United States somewhere between 20 and 30%, has increased dramatically over a single generation of Americans.
Yeah.
So you would have to be arguing a substantial change in the genetics of Americans to say that it was primarily due to genes.
Yeah, and the math probably can't work out. You don't have that much reproductive variance. So let me get into what heritability is in specific terms as opposed to just an example. When I say that the heritability of a trait is say 0.7 or 70%, in technical terms that would be that 70% of the variation of the trait is due to additive genetic variance, which just a shorter way would be just say the variation of the genes within the population explains 70% of the variation of the trait. So what we're talking about here is a population level statistic that's giving us a sense of what is causing the variation within the population. This isn't something that's etched in stone, so heritability calculations actually can change from population to population for the same trait. And in fact, they change, as maybe we'll get into later, they change for traits across the lifetime of individuals. And that's because heritability only exists in the context of a particular genetic or particular environmental background. And that's what you were getting to in terms of obesity. And so maybe you'd like to, you're a doctor, the viewers don't know this, but you're studying to be a doctor. So why don't you talk about pretty common sense environmental changes in regards to obesity?
Well, so you can absolutely have it be heritable in the sense that you inherit a genetic risk from your parents and still be environmentally determined in terms of, we know that people living in particularly not affluent neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods tend to have less access to good food. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, the environment is interacting with a genetic proclivity to cause obesity, which, I mean, gets to the point. Obesity isn't so much what I think we wanted to talk about today. This issue of an environment interacting with genetics is something that I feel like people have trouble wrapping their head around, particularly when it comes to behavior.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. You want to hit on the two different issues with heritability in terms of interaction and correlation. You want me to get to that right now?
Why don't you? That would be great.
Okay, so when we're talking about heritability, we're talking about genetic variation and how it influences the value of a trait, say like height. You can have an interaction where you imagine that you have a set of genes which react. These would be different sets of genes, different genetic variants that would express very differently to different environments. So, for example, you can have, say you have you have a set of genes 1, 2, 3 genetic variants, and another set 4, 5, 6. 4, 5, 6. Let's say in environment A, it correlates with individuals that tend to be taller, right? Let's move into environment B. Let's say it's a lower nutritional environment. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, you might notice that there's no difference between the two genetic types in terms of expressed phenotype at this point. Whatever developmental process was resulting in increased height, when you reduce nutritional inputs, it could be that there is no difference between the two different genotypes. So there you have an interaction with the environment. The expression of the genotype is dependent on the specific environmental background, okay?
Absolutely.
So that's a gene-environment interaction. On the other hand, you have something like a gene-environment correlation, which usually tends to amplify the differences that exist. So I think one of the classic examples in population genetics book is with cows on farms, dairy cows. The cows that are better at producing milk, sometimes the farmers will give them the higher quality feed or give them more feed. This results in those cows producing the most milk.
Yeah.
But
so that's kind of a positive.
Yeah, but that production is not. Yeah, it's a positive feedback loop. That production is not just a function of the genetic difference, even though there is some genetic difference. It's the farmers saw that and decided that they would get greater marginal returns by putting all of their investment into that. So you see this within society in terms of, say, children that might be somewhat better or somewhat worse than average at a particular task, say academics or athletics. But as they develop, they will focus on what their strengths are, and by the time they reach adulthood, there could be rather large differences just due to the fact that their genetic makeup resulted in some differences that push them to make certain choices in terms of the positive feedback loops that they experienced.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, a good example of this in behavior is a paper that you and I have kind of talked about a couple times, which is a longitudinal study about depression that was done in Australia, where it was for a serotonin transporter gene, and what they found was that the gene conferred a certain amount of risk for getting depression, but it worked through interaction with the environment. So if you had the higher risk variant, you were at higher risk for depression, but only if you, well, not only, you were in even higher risk for depression if you had adverse life events in your young life, whereas people who had the low risk variant did not have increased risk in spite of having adverse life events. So the interesting question becomes is this an interaction or is it a correlation? Is the serotonin transporter actively encouraging people to seek out possibly negative situations, or is it just that it's conferring some sort of genetic risk?
Sure.
That it could just happen to you.
Yeah, and that kind of relates to something else that we wanted to get to, and I think maybe we should just jump to that right now.
Sure.
In terms of parental effect. So one paper that kind of made a splash about 10 years ago that is of interest, I think, is a behavior genetic influence paper by Judith Rich Harris, the author of The Nurture Assumption, and she reviewed a lot of data over many decades that showed that about 10% of the variation in personality in the population was due to shared environment, which is basically your parental input, and that about, say, 40% is due to genetic variation, so that's the genes that you get from your parents, and then the balance, about 50%, is unaccounted for, and so you just call that unshared environment. You don't know what that is, and a friend of mine pointed out, even when you do on model organisms, you have inbred lines that are basically clones. That means they're genetically the same.
Sure.
There's still a lot of unshared environment where there's just a lot of noise in there in terms of
it's interesting. It's interesting to think about, they do behavior experiments with inbred lines all the time, and you have to be really super careful about what types of toys they have and how much handling they get and how much light, and even if you are precisely measuring it down to the exact amount of food that they get, you still see a lot of variance.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean that's one thing when you're talking about, say, C. elegans, like, a particular type of nematode. I mean that's of academic interest. But when it comes to, human beings and psychology and our social development, that's a little shocking to a lot of people because, it just seems like intuitively you would think parents do matter. And
I think a lot of parents would object to it.
Yeah, parents would think that. I mean, I'm not sure if kids think that. Yesterday, actually, there was a post by Brian Kaplan at EconLog that talked about this, and he had a theory for why parents think that they do matter, and to me it seemed plausible. Did you get to read that post yet?
I didn't. Why don't you tell me about it?
Okay, so basically, he was answering the question of why do people have such a strong intuition that they can affect their the outcomes of their children if they're wrong, and they're wrong so obviously.
Sure.
Brian Kaplan's explanation is they can affect the outcomes in the short term because parents actually do have a pretty non-trivial effect over the short term. The problem is as people develop and they make their own choices, they tend to shrug off whatever forced choices that their parents made. And so what Brian Kaplan is saying, like, parents see what they see in the proximate as they're raising the children, they see their effect, but we're not good at we're not good at taking into account the long time horizon, right? And so he says that's why he believes parents do think that they matter more than they do.
I guess from a medical point of view, that makes perfect sense to me. I mean, a lot of Judith Harris, who's the person who put forth this data that was kind of showing that parents' role in their kids' future personalities is a lot more limited than they tend to believe. A lot of that has to do with what type of person they are when they're adults. This is, of course, ignoring the fact that if you didn't have parents, it would be unlikely that you would survive to be an adult. I don't think that you could argue that kids, that parents are not necessary for the kind of feeding and clothing aspects, but in terms of the moral instruction, the data isn't really there to suggest that they're inheriting a lot of their values from their parents.
Yeah. A few weeks ago, I posted on a paper that I thought was interesting, which showed basically there's always been data about, say, child abuse or maltreatment and all sorts of things, step-parents and step-children. And the theory from evolutionary psychology is pretty clear in terms of, well, they're not related to each other, so they're not incentivized, et cetera, et cetera. These researchers actually looked at adopted children, and what they found is adopted children, the parents invest a lot into them. In fact, if they invest more into them than if they have adopted and biological, I believe the research showed they invested more into the adopted child than the biological child. And, as you know, it also turns out with adopted children, after they leave the home, they often tend to shrug off that adoptive family's influence. Not all of it. The family can make some difference. But the personality traits that the biological parent confers does have an effect over your lifetime in terms of the choices you make. And so the model here is like, the question is, why are they investing so much into these children? And I think one of the explanations is the children, they often come from dysfunctional backgrounds in terms of who their parents were, in terms of just like who's giving up children for adoption today in the United States. I think these were American adoptees. And so they might require a little more investment for the parents to get what they want out of those children in terms of, doing well in school and whatnot.
Just to play the devil's advocate here, it's also possible that the parents want more. I mean, your average family is having their natural children when they were drunk on Friday night, and they're going through a year-long process to get their adopted children.
That's
Maybe
true.
the parents want more.
Yeah, it's selecting for parents with particular, who, maybe they have certain life experiences that makes them different from, say, a control population. So, I mean, that's definitely a confound. Whenever we talk about these sorts of things, always confounds. We're always very provisional. These ideas are out there, and one of the things with Judith Rich Harris's ideas is that she basically complains that people that, I think these are social psychologists, they interpreted the data in only one way in terms of they assumed that the effect of the parent was always going to be the social basically the environmental input that the parent was making. Right?
Which requires, if you are going to believe that and you see siblings that turn out very differently, you have to assume that the parents acted very differently towards them.
Yeah, yeah. And, like, so, like, there's all these theories about, like, very narrow niches within the home environment.
Like family
and, like,
niche, yeah.
Yeah, and that could be true, but, I mean, in terms of parsimony, she was pointing out, they tend to be really unparsimonious models.
Sure.
So, you know, in terms of... And, you know, you see things with twins where, you know, the unshared environmental difference is the same, but, you know, obviously their concordance, their similarities is directly in proportion to their genetic similarity in terms of their personality traits. So that's very suggestive. In any case, she does have a model for what the unshared environment is, and this is just a hypothesis. Like, nobody really knows what it is. So her model is that it's peer groups, and that what the parents do is select the peer group, and that's that's the biggest thing. That's the most important thing that you can do. And, you know, thinking about it, they kind of do that. Intuitively, parents do know that. They will buy houses in particular neighborhoods so that their kids have a particular school to go to, right? So, I mean,
but I
it's
think
not like this is not totally an unknown, you know, insight.
Yeah, but I think that they're mostly looking for teachers.
Okay.
Not other students.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, it's the idea that you need an older or more mature person to have the input, when some of these data would suggest that what you probably need are your peer groups who give you a standard or a reference in terms of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, right?
Uh-huh.
And so this goes back to, in terms of genetic traits expressing themselves within an environmental context. The peer group would be an environmental context, right? So one of the concepts that, you know, you talk about in behavior genetics and just in genetics in general with heritable traits is norm of reaction. And it basically talks about how you have these different environmental backgrounds, and the traits will express differently in direct proportion to those environmental backgrounds, right? So I think we were talking about earlier about obesity and height. So if you change nutritional input, the distribution of the traits can shift. So imagine that you have a child that's somewhat impulsive or has a high time preference. So, you know, they would be perhaps on a spectrum, less likely to do well in school or plan for the future, you know, just all sorts of, basically the prudent things that I think a lot of parents would want their kids to do. But they could express that imprudence very differently in different peer groups, right? Because people don't have like an absolute standard of being a hellraiser. They're a hellraiser in their particular context. Like, to be like a woman of ill repute in Victorian times is a very different thing than, you know, whatever equivalent that is today.
Bloomers.
You know, I mean, like, basically, like, the very staid, like, conservative people live together before they are married today. That's what you do to be conservative, you know?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, people express themselves in a particular context. And I think we were talking earlier about, you had a little in terms of just computational efficiency, like some biological, I thought they were really interesting biophysical reasons why they would express themselves relatively.
Yeah, I mean, there's a good reason why we tend to think of relative values. And I mean, there's kind of a neuroscientific reason. It's that if you were thinking about a part of the brain that was going to encode value, and you wanted to encode value in sort of absolute terms, where would you set the upper bound? Because the upper bound could be infinite. What you see in the brain over and over again is that it tends to do things in relative terms. And I mean, this is very human stuff. We tend to think of things as relative happiness. A hellraiser, when they're young, is relative to the milieu in which they grew up. And I really think that that's because the brain is better adjusted to dealing with relative values. And we know that it tends to deal with relative values of reward and punishment. Yeah. It's kind of a more parsimonious way to encode information.
Well, I mean, it's like that in the animal world, too. I remember, you know, like, wasn't it like a lot of the sexual selection? They've done experiments and, you could do weird things like attaching extensions to birds and seeing
Sure.
which birds the females like. And they obviously update their algorithm. There's not, like, specific fixed lengths they like. They just like, the males with the longer feathers. That's
makes you sort of think badly about when you're at a bar at night. I mean, I'm still single. It comes to the end of the night, your standards have just plummeted. It's all relative.
Yeah. Okay, so I am reading a book called Predictably Irrational by a behavioral economist, Daniel O'Reilly. And he does talk about relativity a lot in terms of how we think in relative terms and how it causes problems. But in any case, on that specific example, he had an experiment where he basically took images of people and he modified the images of the best-looking individuals, just added some asymmetries to make them somewhat less attractive. What he found is when people had those images in the lineup, they would rate the attractive... When they had the somewhat less attractive version in the lineup, the person that was attractive was rated even more attractive. And so what he suggests is if you really want a wingman... He doesn't say wingman, but this is what he's talking about. If you really want a wingman, you need to find someone that looks like you, but is less attractive, or maybe has a worse personality and is very... Yeah, you need someone that's a good reference point, because once they see that as a reference point, you are the better version, and that adds some value in and of itself.
It's interesting that so symmetry as a trait that humans tend to find attractive is pretty... It's present in nearly all cultures. I imagine that a variety of animal species also tend to find symmetry attractive.
Yeah.
It's interesting that even small asymmetries would be so off-putting. You'd think that perfect symmetry would be suggestive of kind of inbreeding. But, I mean, you're the geneticist. You can tell me if that's true.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated. I mean, you can have... I mean, it's called, like, the term is fluctuating asymmetry, and, if you do enough inbreeding, you can purge what's called the genetic load through really high mortality rates by exposing all the deleterious, right? You can do it with certain types of... The more complex organisms, it's really hard to thread the eye of that needle to get that asymmetrical, right? So you just have a lot of... You have a lot of deleterious alleles within the population. So I think the average human has... I think one quote is 3 new, unique mutations just to themselves. And then they have, just through, meiosis, through all those, just 3 within, I think it's within the sex cells within the gametes, you pass on these 3 that aren't from your ancestors. They're your special contribution to your offspring. And then you have all the ones from your ancestors, right? You have all the deleterious. So, the issue is, most people know about dominance. Dominance is because everyone has, we're diploid organisms. We have 2 copies of a gene. There are many traits there are many genes where you have 1 copy that's functional and 1 copy that's non-functional, and so you don't express whatever negative trait that's the recessive phenotype. But a lot of times there is a little effect of that recessive, right? So it's like 95% of the trait value. Well, that's close enough, or 95% of the fitness. That's close enough. I think they've done studies in Drosophila where they show it's above 90% in these dominant traits in terms of the trait value. That's similar to total, an individual who has two good copies. But that adds up, right? All of these 99, 98% trait values, they add up in terms of dragging your fitness. And, you have a finite number. I think I've seen quotes of 150 or 100 really, really deleterious alleles.
Yeah, there's a lot of genes that if you would lose, you're not going to be viable. I mean,
this is why brother-sister matings are problematic, because they share them. They share a lot of them, and they get exposed, right?
Sure.
So, humans, we already have spontaneous abortion rates on the order of 50%. So already, that's a lot of the genetic load is probably being purged right there in terms of...
Let's go.
Okay, we're back. There was a technical error. In any case, so you have this variance, and that variance within the population is supposedly signaled by various various traits like asymmetry, right? I mean, you have obvious really big pathologies with some people where you can just kind of tell there's something wrong with them. Some types of mental retardation exhibit this, obviously. But even within within the population, there's obviously a variation in physical attractiveness. So the hypothesis is this is just due to sampling variance within the population of the genetic load. Because if you have, say, 100 deleterious alleles, that's the expectation. There could be a lot of variance of that, and it could be within... You see this within even siblings, right? Siblings are not all of the same attractiveness. They're not all of the same trait value, and that's because there's variance, there's sampling variance from the parents in terms of how the alleles are reassorting within the population, And so that's how it works at the genetic level. You're more focused on the neuroscience.
The interesting, the neuroscientific level, I guess it would make sense then that, say I'm a random baby born into a random collection of individuals, I have no sense of what the likely maximum attractiveness is to be. I got to look around and find out. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I develop a set point from what I've seen. I develop a relative value to adapt to whatever environment I'm placed in.
Yeah, and so I mean, there's the deep level is the genetic level, and then it gets expressed in the phenotype, which does all of these proximate behavioral things, or functional expression genetically, and I don't really keep track of that. There's just so much of it. I mean that's what daunts me when I look at neuroscience. There's just so much to keep track of, right? I mean, it's one organ that there's a whole science devoted to. That's crazy, right? I mean, we have...
Yeah, well, and I mean, the interesting part, too, is that neuroscientists tend to be kind of fence-sitters, in that I know neuroscientists who specialize in genetics, and I know ones that specialize in psychology. Mm-hmm. It tends to be kind of a multimodal discipline.
Okay.
Actually, an interesting side fact about this relativistic judgment, there are some individuals who, through brain damage, do not make relativistic judgments well. They make kind of mercenary, very absolute judgments. And it's kind of interesting. They kind of lose their moral sense as a result of it.
So they're sociopaths.
If you test them on a... no, they're not sociopaths. It's that if you subjected them to a variety of difficult moral decisions, mm-hmm. they don't behave like most of us do. For example, most of us will not actively... It's like a... Say there was a trolley.
The trolley type.
Going down the street, and it's going to hit a woman with a baby stroller.
Yeah.
And you could break it, and it would go off the tracks and kill 5 more people. Mm-hmm. Most people profoundly have a problem with not pulling the lever or pulling the lever. This is a very difficult moral decision for people to make. Mm-hmm. But if you would ask people with this particular type of brain damage, they'd be like, oh, hit the lady. Mm-hmm. It's 2 people versus 5 people. This is a very easy decision.
Yeah.
So they almost lose this kind of relativistic nature of the judgment.
Yeah. So I mean, this is it's also is it a specific region of the brain? I mean, I was just curious about this now.
It's a specific. Well, there's a couple that result in this, but mostly they're regions of the prefrontal cortex, which we associate primarily with decision making. And I mean, there's some other aspects of this. There's an element of emotionality that comes into it that we think that in doing this, they're sort of divorcing the emotionality from the decision.
Yeah.
The theories about it are kind of difficult, but you see kind of elements of this absence of relativity that's kind of present in most human beings.
So I'm curious about these individuals. Like you're saying, their absence of relativity, they don't behave normally. I mean, is it just they're really slow at it? Because what do they do? Like, how does this manifest in terms of how do they reason here? Do they reason? Are they just confused?
No. They absolutely do reason. But so the issue with the little trolley car problem is one of agency. It's in pushing the lever and bringing the trolley off the tracks, you're exercising agency that results in the death of 5 people.
Yeah.
Whereas if you did nothing, your inaction resulted in the deaths of 2 people.
Yeah.
Now, people have this inherent bias against agency that results in death. We feel much more comfortable not doing anything in that scenario. what we know from the evidence with this, and I mean, there's good books about this. I believe the book is called The Moral Sense, and the author escapes me at the moment.
Mark Hauser, right?
Mark Hauser has done this research a lot. That's right.
Yeah.
Has done this research a lot, and what he finds is that this uncomfortability with agency is lost in certain types of neurological damage.
Wow. That's pretty intense. So, I like to think in terms of genetics, and, you're the neuroscience guy, but one thing that we are both interested in, I want to touch on, is...
Sure.
Okay, go on.
No, go ahead. I'm listening.
So, I mean, I would just, economics. I'm reading Daniel O'Reilly's Predictably Irrational. I'm really interested. I mean, everyone's interested in economics now a lot, because the whole financial crisis and whatnot. But I mean, I know your interest was before that. You have taken courses in neuroeconomics, and I mean, in general, I want to do two things. Like, I want you to touch on like the value add of neuroeconomics over behavioral economics, which is more just psychology. I'm curious about the physical aspect, because what you just said right there, that seems interesting if we know a specific region, say, of the prefrontal cortex. And then secondly, maybe we should talk about the Posner article in the Review of Animal Spirits in the New Republic. So why don't you start with the general first?
So there's been a lot of interest lately in what's called neuroeconomics, which is trying to understand what parts of the brain participate in economic decision-making.
Yeah.
And this has become particularly relevant lately with the markets falling apart in many, many particular ways. There have been people interested for many years in an area called behavioral economics, which is involved in documenting all the ways that people make bad economic decisions. Mm-hmm. So neuroeconomics is trying to assign some sort of brain mechanism to try and understand why we make those decisions and how they're implemented. And they have some interesting findings, I think. We've found brain regions that are significant for lots of these economic decision or flaws in economic decision making.
Yeah.
I am not impressed yet, and I think that they have to do a lot more. Like, for example, we knew that the orbital frontal cortex is involved in economic decision making before neuroeconomics, because individuals with orbital frontal lesions gamble away all their money and generally destroy their financial lives, among other things.
Yeah.
So there's a level where it's kind of kicking in open doors. Mm-hmm. What I would like to see from neuroeconomics is more stuff looking at the representations of money in the brain and how those can be distorted by the way the brain works. And further, you get this sense from neuroeconomics and behavioral economics that there's almost this determinism of bad behavior. Like, human beings will misbehave, they'll lie, they'll cheat, they'll steal.
Yeah.
And there's no looking at, there are some people, some of us know them, who are not totally screwed in this economic environment. There are some people who have done well, who have made good decisions and chosen to save.
Sure.
I would like to see emphasis in what are the neural mechanisms that allow us to improve.
Yeah.
But then again, as you were like to say, this is partly because I'm going to be a physician someday and I want to see some way out.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is, like, there are individual differences. Humans vary, right? I have a friend who's an economist who's done psychometric work to show how, like, your average intelligence affects your potential earning power, and it explains a lot, but it doesn't explain everything. I mean, I think it's on the order of, like, like the R squared is like 0.3 or 0.4, so like 30 or 40% can be explained just by your intelligence. And there's...
Although the question that I would ask him, and I mean, this is stuff that we've talked about before, is it the intelligence, or is it something related to the intelligence, like time preference?
Sure. And he says, what he thinks, and this is actually one of the avenues that he's going to look at, is he thinks there's some element of time preference that is orthogonal, that's independent from intelligence, and that explains some of the differences where I'm sure you have known. I mean, I've known people that are actually very intelligent, as intelligent as I am, who make really bad choices. And it's kind of perplexing because they are intelligent. Like, you have a stereotype, like, these are people that, they do well on tests. Yeah. They can, like, derive proofs. why can't they make life decisions, you know? Why do they procrastinate?
Sure.
And it's really strange. But, I mean, there's other types of personality differences that I think come into play. And then there's people who, like, you know, they're not necessarily that bright, but they're very, very, they're very studious in a way where it's just like they're just always working. They're always working. And, you know, they might not be, like, the most brilliant people, but they get things done, right? And so these are people who, like, you know, they're punching above their, you know, weight, I guess is what I would say. And he's trying to look at some of that in terms of how that affects people. But, you know, if things like time preference, and time preference, just so viewers know, basically, would you forego something now to have more in the future? So I think, you know, like you can do it even with children. Like, would you take a Snickers bar now, or would you wait the next day to get two? And so, you know, someone that has low time preference, well, they'll wait the next day. I mean, the idea is, like, if you have low time preference, like, that's what capitalism is based on. You invest, you know, and you compound.
Yeah, you save, you wait.
Yeah,
you work.
And you don't just consume now. And some of this, obviously, is cultural. Like, cultures have different values of time preference, I think, in terms of, like, do you want to purchase and consume and display now to show your status? Or would you rather be, you know, investing it, kind of hoarding it away and, you know, make your money, quote, work for you, which hasn't really worked out that well right now. But, you know, over the long term, the trend line has been up in terms of economic growth and productivity, right? So, in any case...
The evidence that we have from neuroscience is that not only are these culturally derived behaviors, but they're learned behaviors. Mm-hmm. So the kind of Head Start doesn't work that well, sure. But the sort of school programs that we have that actually improve outcomes are ones that tend to emphasize what neuroscientists call executive functioning, which is like ability to delay gratification, impulse control, stuff like that. And the evidence that we have is that these are learned behaviors. Uh-huh. So it would certainly kind of play into your idea of a person who's very smart but hasn't gotten that executive functioning down won't necessarily be successful.
Yeah. I mean, the issue is, yes, there are cultural... This is, again, where the environmental background matters a lot in terms of how things express, right? But, you know, when you look at, say, siblings, when you look at people that are raised in the same peer groups, like, those differences are fascinating. And, you know, if you could figure out, like, what underlying variables explain those, that would be interesting. That would be part of the puzzle. But, you know, it could also be noise. It could just be random acts, right? Contingency.
Sure.
You know, I mean, that's a lot of them. That's an answer that I don't think people like, though. You know? I mean, on the one hand...
people feel uncomfortable with the absence of agency involved.
Yeah, well, I mean, they feel like, you know, I think what the issue is in, I don't know, like, have you read any of Nassim Taleb's work? He's really famous now for The Black Swan.
Yeah, I've been reading The Black Swan.
Okay, but he wrote Fooled by Randomness, like before he got famous for The Black Swan. And one of the things that he points out is there was a book out called The Millionaire Next Door that was really popular in the 1990s. And he pointed out, like, that book is really not that good because it shows you only the winners. It doesn't show you all the losers who might have done exactly the same things, who didn't work. Yeah. So, I mean, you know, that's part of the issue. It's like, if someone does well, I mean, I think in psychology they call it the fundamental attribution error, right? You attribute to characters instead of situation. People do that all the time. If you're successful, I mean, people do that selectively. If you're successful, it's because of your character. If you're not successful, it's because of the situation.
Yeah,
you know?
Absolutely.
And so, but, you know, if it is just noise, I guess, you know, like all these fields like behavioral economics, neuroeconomics, behavior genetics, I mean, they're trying to pin down stuff that's not noise. I mean, noise, like, in an ultimate philosophical sense, there is no noise probably, but as human beings, there are limitations to what we can know and understand, right?
Well, and I mean, the result may be, and we were talking about this with genes and environmental interactions, the result may be a very complicated picture where genes and environment interact in positive and negative feedback loops, and the result from that scenario is highly unpredictable. And like you said, it may look a lot like noise, even if it isn't actually noise.
Well, I mean, that's just like deterministic chaos, which technically is deterministic, but it looks...
But you wouldn't know ahead of time.
Yeah, I mean, that's a philosophical question. Like, some people say, like, you shouldn't even say it's deterministic. Yeah, I mean, I know what you're saying, but there's no way you could ever figure it out, so it is just noise. Like, operationally, it's noise, you know? Unless you become omniscient, it's never really deterministic. You only know it's deterministic because you started it, you know? And so there could be a lot. There could be a lot of things in terms of dynamic systems in societies or in human development that have that aspect of deterministic chaos where they're contingent on very small differences, and they go in unpredictable directions. And if we're saying 50%, on the order of 50% of many life outcomes that we care about are like that, if it's not just peer group, I don't think it's an answer people would really be happy with, because they feel like they need to be able to do something, and that where people are in life is a just dessert,
Yeah, I guess, although the alternative that you could argue, say you're talking to a parent who is uncomfortable with the notion that they don't have complete control over their kids' future personality, you could say that there is stuff about which you have primary control, and there's stuff that you have very little control over, and you should accept what you can't change, and you should try and change what you can.
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of, you almost have to get into this zen of circumscribed action, where you accept what you can do and not what you can't.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty, it's a standard. I mean, to some extent, sometimes I wonder about the value add of all the new science if, we're basically, we're still
Maybe we're just beating ourselves up.
Yeah, we're just common sense. There's only so much you can do. Don't do something really bad, and then the rest of it is, you just got to let the kids make the choices in their lives, because you can't be their parents forever. It's only up until 18, or if you're paying for college, 22 probably, or paying for the health insurance up until 25. But in any case, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
It's people should really take a more hands off. I mean, some of this, Judith Rich Harris points out some of this in terms of helicopter parents or parents that are very hands off. It's a cultural shift, So, in Britain, the upper classes have traditionally sent their kids away to boarding schools, and the boarding schools, they have some constraints, but a lot of times these peer groups just raise themselves, and they develop their own subcultures, and they're totally separate from their, and I don't know what you think of British aristocrats, but they're not all sociopathic. Winston Churchill was a British aristocrat.
No, well, I certainly don't think that. The interesting part actually about it is that the cultures that they build at places like Eton are relatively stable over many, many years.
Yeah.
Which is interesting considering the cycle of children that have gone through during that period.
Exactly. So it's the people change, and yet the underlying memes can stay relatively static because of just the way the inertia of the peer group works. People are just cycling through, but the memes, they're just they're what's continuous at Eton.
I wonder whether high schools are like that. I should go back to my high school and find out whether it's similar culturally to how it was when I remember.
Yeah, well,
probably not.
Well, but initial conditions have a long-term effect, right? So, again, we were talking about relativity, maybe if you were in a preppy high school in the 80s or 90s, I don't know what the new term in the teens will be, but maybe you can see that the high schools that were in, say, position X in 1988, they're the ones that tend to be in position Z in 2018. There was a Marginal Revolution post, I think it was to a paper, that showed the basically brands that started out in a particular city or a region, even decades later, they have a much higher level of market share within that region. And this is decades later, like Heinz in Pittsburgh.
And do you think that this can be attributable? there's lots of company towns out there. I imagine GM is relatively well liked in Detroit.
Well, the Heinz, you're right, Heinz is big in Pennsylvania, especially Pittsburgh, but Miller Beer was introduced earliest in Chicago, and it has a much higher market. Chicago's huge, right? I don't think...
Sure.
I think...
It's no way that they could dominate the beer market.
No. When people move to Chicago from other places, it's not it's not like Pittsburgh, which is kind of a declining town, and there's probably relative stasis in terms of not as many new people moving there. But Chicago, there's so much churn, so that sort of thing to me is very suggestive. There's many things that we don't understand. There are many patterns and variables that we don't understand, and that we just have kind of glimmers at that are pretty strange when you think about it. I think they're kind of mind blowing. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. So let's hit the Posner article before we sign off.
Sure.
So, why don't you read it? I read it. Well, why don't you talk about it? Because you kind of have more opinions on it.
Okay. Posner was reviewing a book called Animal Spirits by Schiller and Akeroff about which was the phrase "animal spirits" is from John Maynard Keynes, a famous economist who's come back into fashion lately, and animal spirits was kind of what Keynes was referring to was kind of man's tendency to be horribly irrational. And Keynes went on to build his impression of what economic systems should be based on and how they should be organized and what the government's role is, based on this idea that man could, in many ways, not be trusted to run his economic affairs.
Yeah.
So Richard Posner read this book, and the book, as I understand it, is primarily kind of documentation of many absurd things that human beings have done in their economies and bad decisions that they've made. Yeah. And Posner poses this kind of correction to Schiller and Egeroff's impression of what animal spirits meant. What Posner argues is that that Keynes thought that animal spirits were necessary for economic growth, is that because we're kind of stupid and not terribly wise, we go out and be enterprising, that capitalism might need us to commit all of the fallacies that behavioral economics says we regularly commit in order to continue to grow.
Yeah. I mean, that's the really striking insight. When I read that, I mean, I could see where he's coming from. I think one of the things that you pointed out in a different conversation we had is a lot of the behavioral economics layer, it's microeconomic, right? So it's about individual behavior.
Yes, absolutely.
But people are trying to connect that to macroeconomic dynamics, like the whole economy. And, you know, I mean, one thing that I said, I think, is if there are systematic biases, you could assume that those systematic they're not just random across the population. You can assume that they would have a macro effect. But in terms of that specific insight, how you need people to have animal spirits, I read a book several years ago by David Warsh about economic growth, and one of the interesting points that seemed implicit in the book is economic growth is due to innovation, and innovation is due to basically scientific production, technology, etc. But the main issue here is this innovation produces enormous positive externalities, like spillover effects for society, increasing their productivity. So, like, say, technology. So, you know, information technology today is an example of that. The people that work in and invest, primarily the investors in these information technologies, are very wealthy. You know, they're the wealthiest people in the country. But the value that they add to the economy is orders of magnitude greater than their wealth.
Sure.
And one of the issues that I was thinking about is scientists, for the amount of education that they get, are actually relatively poor. And it seems that the rational choice would be to become a doctor or, you know, maybe get an MBA and make a lot of money without, you know, having like 8 years of education. It seems like an irrational choice if you're looking at prices as the signal for what is valuable, right? But the implication from from these endogenous growth theories is that these irrational choices are creating the positive spillover effect that is resulting in growth. Like what's the marginal return? What's the marginal return of, you know, millions of more lawyers, or even in the United States at least, doctors, right? I mean, there is some
might actually be negative.
Yeah, I mean, there's marginal returns maybe, but at some point there's only so much of those type of services that you need. But in terms of engineers, you know, that might be true, but who knows what the next great technological innovation is, right? The game changer. Because I mean, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about something that can like change all of society. It's kind of like you know, Archimedes. He said if he had like a long enough lever, he could move the world. That's the sort of thing that technology is in terms of increase, like in terms of energy and information. We're so many orders of magnitude beyond what we were decades ago. While, you know,
But the interesting part, to get back to this issue of animal spirits, is, well, and you were just saying this, that scientists, if they were choosing to do it to make money, have made an exceptionally bad choice.
Yes.
But if you believe Keynes that we make bad economic choices habitually and that it's probably better than we do, then we're happy.
Yeah.
We're happy that scientists are in fact mildly insane. Well, that we kind of need them to be mildly insane and not making the easy, uncertain choice in order to continue to grow.
Exactly. Well, I mean, I think the thing is you need variation in choices. You need different choices, because you do need people that make the low-risk choices. You do need people that become doctors. And then you need people to make high-risk choices who think that they're going to become the next Bill Gates, even though you can only have one in a generation. Or if you had Larry Ellison, two in a generation. I mean, these are extreme winner-take-all scenarios, you know. I know plenty of people that, are, you know, think they're going to be the next great, you know, venture capital success story, or I have known of people. There just aren't that many. You know, most people have to, you know, throw in the towel and just get a regular job or just, you know, pay the bills. But there are people that will invest their time and effort in doing this for years and years because of this winner-take-all. I mean, part of the issue is, like, you know, economic rationality is predicated on the idea that prices are the signal that we're looking at. You know, just in terms of, you know, money, right? But, I mean, maybe some people are just looking at fame. You know, there's other issues that are going on that are driving the animal spirits. Maybe animal spirits is basically all the spirits that are not economically motivated in a traditional way, right?
Yeah, or that even if they were economically motivated in a traditional way in terms of making lots of money, it's that precisely that we misperceive them, that we get them wrong. That is a necessary trait, and at least a small percentage of people. That it's kind of a necessary characteristic if you want to get these types of innovations.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things, and I've talked to plenty of people about this, and I've read about other people saying the same thing, the decline of quantitative, or the relative decline of quantitative finance, you know, the bloom on that field is kind of decreased, might result in more technical people, a greater number of the technical people that would go into quantitative finance going into, say, you know, working on better microchips, you know, solid state physics, you know, stuff like that, which is like, in terms of a rational choice, in terms of the money you can make in finance, there's no competition. Like, going into finance is a rational choice. But I'm really skeptical that that there are as much marginal return on increased capital allocation efficiency as there are in, say, producing, you know, much better microchips than we have right now, or even something like say a battery that lasts for days instead of 3 hours. That would actually that would be a battery that's much smaller, a battery that doesn't, you know, there's something like that could actually make a huge difference in terms of just productivity, as opposed to, you know, capital allocation. So, you know, it's complicated, you know, and you got to kind of figure out what you can figure out. And I don't know. I haven't read Animal Spirits. I mean, Schiller's. I've read Irrational Exuberance. He kind of has a style that I think would throw someone like Posner off in terms of he just kind of throws like everything at you. It's not very systematic. I mean, he's just inundates you with facts, you know, and just anecdotes and like examples.
I liked Posner's kind of historical look at what he meant, though.
Yeah.
I like that kind of take. It made sense to me.
Well, you know what I liked about it? That he had to correct a Nobel. I think like isn't Akerlof a Nobel laureate? And like Schiller, who's a relatively prominent economist, like they obviously hadn't read Keynes very closely, which like that happens, you know. I mean, to some extent, that's There's a lot of like, you know, evolutionary biologists that haven't read Darwin that closely either. So I mean, in these sorts of fields that fancy themselves progressive in terms of like the past doesn't matter that much, you know, that happens. But I found that amusing because, you know, everyone makes errors about what they think they know based on secondary sources, and the secondary sources are misrepresenting, right? And I think that's probably what was happening there. But I know you have to go. Is there anything else that you wanted to say?
No, I think that we captured the key thing.
Okay.
The key thing was really talking about the kind of complexity that we tend to deal with in these genetic and environmental systems. And trying to take a step back and deal with that complexity.
Okay, well, I mean, all I would say to that is it's really, really complex, but instead of just kind of, you know, calling it a day, I think the main way that we can really tackle it is addressing it in a multidisciplinary way. So, say an economic question, you got to look at all the different angles, and you can't just rely on a simple mathematical model with a few a priori assumptions. Like, you know, I think at some point neuroscience will come into play. Psychology obviously comes into play. I think there's behavior genetic insights that also come into play. And we didn't talk about this, but I have an acquaintance who's an economist who's trying to do a lot of basically behavior genomics of economic games. So he's trying to use genetic sequencing technology to correlate that with behavior in, say, the Ultimatum game and a variety of other games that are in the accepted toolkit of behavioral economists. So, this is just the beginning, and hopefully, maybe we should do this some other time. Maybe a year we can update it. I'm sure there'll be a lot.
I love it. Let's do it.
Going on.
Hopefully, we'll have more to say.
And I'll see you this summer at the Science Blogs meetup, Jake.
Take care. I'm looking forward to it.
Take it easy, man.